Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the warm congratulations as well, too. I appreciate that. I thought I would just run through a few things, start off a conversation. Happy to discuss and answer questions and things that are going on as well. I want to start with something that we haven't said very much lately because we haven't needed to. But I just want to remind all of you that the administration's objectives in working with Ukraine have been unchanged for 2 years now, since I first had a meeting with Secretary of State Tillerson about taking on this role. And he asked if I would be interested, and I said, well, I want to make sure I understand what the goals are. And I said, in my mind, the goals need to be the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the safety and security of all Ukrainian citizens, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, or religion. And he had not heard it formulated that way before, but he said, absolutely, that's our goal. And so he said it first in his remarks in Kyiv in July 2017, and we've been consistent on that theme over time. And I feel that while Russia has not changed its approach to Ukraine, we have made a lot of headway in strengthening support for those objectives, in seeing Ukraine become stronger and more resilient and have a stronger identity, to have greater support from the Europeans and from the United States, and for this now to have changed the equation in a way where time is now more on Ukraine's side than it was on Russia's side before. So I think that is a positive set of developments. Now, as you know, Ukraine recently had its presidential election and is in the throes of a parliamentary election campaign, with those elections to be held on July 21st. So a couple of thoughts on that. I want to be clear that President Poroshenko did a great job at a difficult time in Ukraine's history. And I don't think people should forget that. Ukraine was attacked. They had to defend the country to try to win back some territory, to stabilize the border, the boundary inside the country. He had to build international support, he had to rebuild the military, and he got more done on reform in Ukraine during his tenure as president than all of the preceding presidents did since Ukraine's independence. So that was a lot of accomplishment. But what we saw in the election that took place, the presidential election, is that not only did he do that, but the Ukrainian people wanted more. They wanted more, faster, better, newer, fresher, younger, different, change everything. Sounds familiar. And, and that is, I think, what now President Zelensky was promising. He was a face who had never been in politics before. He's a generation younger. He would have been 13 when Ukraine regained its independence. That is going to be a different kind of person than someone who had been active politically and in business and other things during the Soviet system. So there's a change here, and I think that was one thing that people latched onto. He promised to take reform further and deeper and faster, and that's what the public bought into. But I think that his words, his television show, his statements about Ukraine and the system of how much influence the oligarchs have over politics, judiciary, economy, life in Ukraine, and frankly, depress the success of the country. He understood that, and he communicated that, and I think that was another big factor in why people decided to vote for him. Now, there is a lot of watching as he has become president and does not have a majority of votes in the Rada at this time. What will he actually do? That's what he said. What will he actually do? And we've seen some very good names brought into his circle that are known as reformers or known as being very pro-Atlanticist and very pro-European for Ukraine. And we've seen others that have ties to oligarchs and raise concerns about what direction this is heading in. But with 73% of the people who voted in the second round of the presidential election voting for him, he now has an obligation to those people that he will deliver on what he promised to deliver on. And from the perspective of the United States or Western Europe, we look at this and say, well, there's something changing in Ukraine. And the future of Ukraine for the next 5 years is probably going to be charted. It's going to be determined in the next 3 months. And everybody is going to be trying to influence that, whether it's the Russians, or whether it's the oligarchs, or whether it's reformers. Everybody is going to be trying to shape that. So it is imperative for the United States and for the European Union, individual European countries, to do everything possible to try to engage with President Zelensky now and help him achieve what he said he will achieve. And this will require a demonstration of independence and that he is really the president and that he is really in charge. It can't be a situation where he even gives the appearance of favoring an oligarch or favoring some or not changing the system for his own political good fortunes and for our relationships going forward. He needs to be able to achieve a working majority in the parliament that can support a reform agenda, and he needs to be able to deliver on that agenda. And I think it's incumbent on the United States and on the EU and others to say that if he delivers on that agenda, we will be giving our full support to that as well, and we want to see that be successful. You'll remember during the election campaign, there was a lot of pressure on everybody to take a position. Do you support this candidate? Do you support that candidate? And I very much argued that we don't do that, and we won't do that. We will not support an individual. We will support principles and policies. And that is still the case now that we know who won the election. We support the same principles and the same policies, and we want to see them realized. I'm very pleased that so far we've done as much as we can, and we intend to keep doing it. President Trump called, well, I should back up. Secretary of State Pompeo called President Poroshenko and candidate Poroshenko on the eve, candidate Zelensky on the eve of the election. And President Trump congratulated President Zelensky on the night after he had won the election. The inauguration, as you know, was put together very quickly. We thought it might come a little bit later, and so we put together a U.S. presidential delegation on about 2 days' notice, which included a cabinet secretary, Rick Perry, Secretary of Energy, included a U.S. Senator, Ron Johnson, it included our ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and myself, and National Security Council staffer, and our chargé. So it was a robust, and I would say high-level American delegation that went to the inauguration. Not true of a lot of countries, I must say. The Baltic states sent their presidents, Georgia sent its president. I was very impressed to see that solidarity in the region is very important. Not too many others sent that high-level delegation, but the United States was fully represented. We then came back as a delegation and met with President Trump and briefed him about our impressions and how we think we need to be acting in the coming period. And we have begun to take steps on that, including President Trump sending a letter to President Zelensky congratulating him and inviting him to come for a visit to the White House at a date to be determined. And we are still working on getting a date, but believe me, we will. And we will also look for other opportunities to engage to support that reform agenda that I talked about. It is easy to forget that all of this has taken place in 23 days. It seems like it was longer ago, and a lot has been done, and a lot has happened in that period of time, and there is a rich agenda going forward. There will be bilateral visits to Paris and Berlin. There was already a meeting with Secretary General Stoltenberg where President Zelensky affirmed his commitment to Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO, very important, I would argue. There were also senior level EU meetings. There will be an EU summit in early July. There will be the Reform Conference on Ukraine economic reform hosted by Canada on July 2nd and 3rd. We are already committed. I will be there, but Deputy Secretary of State Sullivan will be there. We are looking further at who else we may be able to get there to make sure we have a robust American presence at that as well. And we will be looking at further senior level visits to Kyiv coming up, because we want to follow through on that commitment that if there's a chance for Ukraine to really break out of an oligarchic system that has dominated the country since the early days of privatization. We need to take that chance now, and we will do everything we can to be as helpful as we can. I have a couple other thoughts. Are we live tape here? Okay, so I'll be careful. But I mentioned the presence of Baltic state leaders and Georgian leader at the inauguration. I want to play this back into the United States. A lot of you are active in Ukrainian American communities, and there needs to be a reinvestment in solidarity among our Central and East European diaspora groups here in this country. Ukrainians, Georgians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks. Individually, there may be some that are larger in number, like the Poles, some that are smaller in number, like the Estonians. But collectively, you have a shared memory, a shared set of understandings about what's going on in the world, and your voices do matter. And this was a very important factor in achieving the historic enlargements of NATO 20 years ago for Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, 15 years ago for the Prague Summit, and the Baltic states, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. And I think when we talk about Ukraine and its aspirations, and when we talk about Georgia and its desire to join NATO and the EU, that it is important that this community be strong and be together. Just like NATO itself, a victory for one is a victory for all. And I think that's a point that should be stressed, especially as we head into a fresh political season in this country. With that, I will pause. I'd love to take a few questions and give any comments on those, and have a good conversation, because I'm surrounded by experts and practitioners and participants in this process in Ukraine, and I'd love to hear from you as well.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for your thoughts, and I would like to make one comment and then follow up with a question and then turn it over to our audience here. I'm glad that you raised the issue in terms of cooperation and working together with other nationality groups. I think that's something that the Ukrainian community nationally, that's evident here in Washington in our work with the Central and Eastern European Coalition, but also that's a model that's been taken to our local communities. I'm proud to say that communities like Cleveland, particularly where I'm from, Philadelphia, and others, they're very good examples of movements that have been formed in terms of a coalition, particularly with our Eastern European brothers and sisters and nationalities. And that's something that we continue to stress. It's something that we continue to impress upon our communities that they need to work on it. So I'm glad that you raised that particular issue. My question to you is, again, I know we're in public here, but and you acknowledge this, I've acknowledged this, others have acknowledged this, that a lot has been done in terms of progress, and credit needs to be given to President Poroshenko for his work in Parliament and others. In terms of U.S. priorities of that further reform, where are the U.S. priorities in terms of wanting those next changes? Is it with the reform of the security service? Is it still in the energy sector? Where can possibly, in some of these efforts, we can engage ourselves as well to be helpful to convince members of Parliament or the current Ukrainian government in terms of things that they need to act?
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And you're tempted to say, well, it's hard to know where to start. But there are a few places that we do highlight. One of them is continued pursuit of some of the anti-corruption measures that have been in place. There are a few, such as the restoration of legislation that prohibits illicit wealth accumulation by members of Parliament. That was struck down by a court. It needs to be revised and reapproved. There is the maintenance of the nationalization of Privatbank, which of course was Mr. Kolomoisky's bank, but this This was a significant drain of resources that the Ukrainian people eventually had to fill through nationalization, and ultimately the IMF contributions and others have helped to restore the Ukrainian national budget. So we're paying for this too. And it's very important that we not see a reversal of the cleaning up of that bank, and that those who put in the investments are not then seeing those frittered away again. So that's a very important reform. Reforms in the judiciary. It's very important that you have a qualified, credible, and independent judiciary for the administration of the rule of law. And I think it is particularly important also to look at the oligarchic system itself. You have a situation where too few people own too much. And that gives undue influence over lots of things, over the judiciary, over the RADA, over the media. And this deters foreign investment, which in turn, and it creates a situation where corruption is possible. And that also deters foreign investment, and that depresses Ukrainian economic growth, it depresses jobs, it depresses wages, and it holds the country back. Ukraine, by all rights, should be a wealthy country. It has fabulous people, fabulous natural resources. It has a great location and great agriculture, great soil. Everything about Ukraine should be productive. And it's not achieving that, and I think this is one of the fundamental reasons. So a reform of the system, such as implementation of antitrust legislation, rigorous implementation of antitrust legislation, would be a very important step. And I think it needs to be done in a way that brings the country together as well. One of the things we saw in Georgia after the Georgian Dream was first elected was a 3-year period of retribution against the United National Movement after they took power, which was wasted time in Georgia. And it really set the country back. The country is doing very well, again now, but it took time for that Georgia Dream government to find its footing and start governing, and now it's doing very well in governance. I don't think Ukraine should go the direction of political retribution. I think it should go the direction of finding the right formulas for rule of law and the implementation of that, and cleaning up the economy, and as necessary, if people give up their assets and follow the rules, pay a tax, give an amnesty as well, and get beyond this and move forward. I think that would be a significant direction if it could be achieved. You mentioned the energy sector, and there are several things in the energy sector that are important. And I note that Secretary of Energy Rick Perry was the leader of the U.S. presidential delegation for the inauguration. He's talked about assisting Ukraine with gas storage, which I think is important. I think we want to make sure that any shut-off of Russian gas transit in Ukraine does not have an adverse impact on Ukraine, and that means finding ways to fill up the gas reserve caverns that are there. But he also talked